When we talk about avoidant personalities, we have to start by dismantling one of the biggest illusions they live under, the idea that distance equals freedom. On the surface, avoidance looks like strength. It looks like independence, self-sufficiency, emotional control. They tell themselves, I don't need much, or I'm better on my own, or people complicate my life. And for a while, that story works. In fact, early on, avoidance is often rewarded. Less conflict, less vulnerability, less emotional exposure. But psychology teaches us something very uncomfortable here. What feels like freedom in the short term often becomes confinement in the long term. Avoidants aren't free, they're quiet, and there's a big difference. Human beings are wired for connection, not dependency, not chaos, not drama, but regulated, meaningful connection. When an avoidant consistently suppresses emotional needs, they don't eliminate those needs, they push them underground. And anything pushed underground doesn't disappear, it waits. Over time, their emotional world becomes smaller. Fewer people get close. Fewer conversations go deep. Fewer moments feel truly shared. What's left is a life that looks calm on the outside, but feels strangely hollow on the inside. Loneliness for an avoidant doesn't arrive loudly. It doesn't show up as heartbreak or desperation. It shows up as numbness, as boredom, as a constant need for distraction. Work, routines, scrolling, surface-level connections, these become substitutes for intimacy. And the tragedy is that the avoidant often interprets this emptiness as proof that they were right all along. See, relationships don't really add much, but what they're actually experiencing is not peace. It's emotional starvation. Now here's where it connects directly to you. While you were present, while you were investing, while you were trying to build something real, the avoidant didn't feel lonely. They felt pressure. They felt exposed. They felt seen. And instead of recognizing that discomfort as a doorway to growth, they labeled it as a threat. So they pulled back. And in doing so, they assumed they were choosing relief. But relief is temporary. Loneliness is cumulative. As time passes, the absence of genuine connection begins to weigh on them. Not consciously at first. They might even feel a strange sense of pride in how unaffected they are. But slowly, life loses depth. Conversations feel repetitive. New connections feel shallow. The same patterns repeat with different faces. And eventually there's a quiet moment, usually alone, where the truth slips through. Not everyone is replaceable. Not every bond is the same. And not every person who offered closeness was trying to take something from them. Avoidants don't realize they're lonely because they don't define loneliness the way most people do. To them, loneliness isn't about being alone. It's about feeling emotionally unsafe. And here's the paradox. They created emotional safety by keeping people at a distance, but they sacrificed emotional nourishment in the process. Safety without connection eventually becomes isolation. And this is why your role matters so deeply in their internal story. You weren't noise, you weren't chaos, you weren't the problem. You were evidence that connection could exist without control, intimacy without entrapment, closeness without collapse. But they weren't ready to integrate that truth. So now, when the quiet stretches too long, when distractions stop working, when life feels strangely flat, that loneliness has nowhere to hide. And whether they admit it or not, it forces a realization. Avoiding pain also meant avoiding depth, meaning, and real human warmth. Here's the final truth to sit with. Distance didn't protect them from loneliness. It guaranteed it. One of the most misunderstood dynamics in avoidance psychology is this belief that you were the source of their discomfort, that your presence created pressure, that your needs, your questions, your emotional availability somehow made life heavier for them. From their perspective, pulling away felt like self-preservation, like finally being able to breathe. And when you stepped back or disappeared altogether, they assumed that relief would follow. But what actually followed was something they were never prepared for: emotional silence. Here's the critical distinction they failed to make. You weren't the cause of their tension. You were the trigger that exposed it. Avoidants often live with unexamined internal stress, old attachment wounds, unresolved fears of dependency, a deep association between closeness and loss of autonomy. When you showed up consistently, when you asked for clarity, intimacy, or emotional reciprocity, you activated those buried fears. And instead of recognizing that activation as an invitation to self-awareness, they externalized it. It was easier to say, this relationship is too much, than to ask, why does closeness feel unsafe to me? So when you removed yourself, they expected calm. And at first they might have felt it. No more conversations that went deep. No more emotional mirrors. No more moments that asked them to show up fully. But that calm was deceptive, because what disappeared along with you wasn't just intensity, it was regulation. What avoidants rarely realize is that emotionally attuned people often act as stabilizers in their lives. Your presence helped organize their emotional world, even if they never consciously acknowledged it. You grounded conversations. You brought coherence. You offered warmth and continuity. And once that was gone, what they felt wasn't freedom, it was a vacuum. Absence has a way of clarifying things that presence can't. In your absence, there was no one to gently anchor them, no one reflecting emotional depth back to them, no one creating a rhythm of connection, and slowly, that silence became uncomfortable, not dramatic, not obvious, but heavy, a low-grade loneliness that followed them into quiet moments, late nights, and emotionally flat days. Here's where the realization sharpens. They didn't miss the relationship at first, they missed the regulation, and then they missed the meaning. They begin to notice that life feels oddly understimulating, that new connections don't land the same way, that conversations stay on the surface, that something essential is missing, but they can't quite name it. And in that confusion, a difficult truth starts to form. The problem wasn't that you were there, it's that now you're not. Psychologically, this is where avoidance turns inward. Without someone to project tension onto, they're left alone with their internal landscape. The anxiety doesn't disappear, the restlessness doesn't resolve, it just has fewer places to hide. And that's when absence becomes louder than presence ever was. You didn't create their discomfort, you revealed it. And when you left, you didn't take pressure with you. You took connection, coherence, and emotional grounding. That's the irony avoidants come to face far too late. What they labeled as too much was actually what kept them emotionally balanced. And once it's gone, they're forced to confront a reality they never anticipated. Your absence didn't bring peace. It exposed the loneliness that was already there. The closing truth is simple and unsettling. When your presence is gone and the emptiness grows, they finally understand you were never the weight. You were the anchor there. There's a subtle but crucial misunderstanding at the heart of avoidant psychology, and it sits right at the intersection of intimacy and autonomy. Avoidants often believe that emotional closeness equals control, that being seen means being trapped, that letting someone in automatically means losing themselves. And because of that belief, they misread the very people who offer them the most safety. You weren't trying to control them. You weren't trying to take away their freedom. You were offering something far more threatening to an Avoidant nervous system, emotional safety. For someone with avoidant patterns, safety doesn't feel soothing at first. It feels destabilizing. When a person is consistent, attuned, and emotionally present, it removes the familiar chaos that avoidants use to orient themselves. Distance, unpredictability, and emotional ambiguity are what they know how to manage. Safety asks something different. It asks them to soften, to stop scanning for exits, to sit with feelings instead of outrunning them. And that's where the confusion begins. You created a space where they didn't have to perform, impress, or stay guarded. You offered reliability without demands, intimacy without force, presence without intrusion. But instead of recognizing that as grounding, they experienced it as pressure. Not because you were asking for too much, but because safety leaves no place to hide. When someone offers emotional safety, it shines a light on everything unresolved. Old fears surface, attachment wounds activate. The internal voice that says, if I let this in, I might lose control gets louder. So the avoidant reframes the experience. They tell themselves you're overwhelming, too intense, too serious, too close. That narrative protects them from facing the real fear, that intimacy doesn't destroy them, but it does change them. What they never realized is that safety isn't about limitation. It's about expansion. You weren't anchoring them to a cage. You were grounding them to something real. Your emotional presence provided a base, something steady they could return to. And psychologically, that kind of base allows people to explore the world more freely, not less. But avoidants often don't trust that concept. They learned early on that closeness came with strings, expectations, or emotional cost. So when someone shows up without those conditions, it doesn't compute. Instead of asking, why does this feel unfamiliar? They ask, why does this feel uncomfortable? And discomfort gets blamed on you. But here's what happens after you were gone. Without emotional safety, everything becomes effort again. Conversations require masks. Connections feel transactional. There's no place to land emotionally, no space where they can exhale. And that's when the truth begins to surface. Safety wasn't suffocating them, it was supporting them. They start to notice how regulated they felt around you, how grounded, how moments of stress didn't spiral the same way, how being with you didn't drain them, it stabilized them. And the painful realization follows: what they mistook for control was actually care. What they labeled as pressure was presence. Avoidants don't fear love. They fear the vulnerability that safety demands. And when someone offers it without force, without manipulation, without conditions, it confronts them with a question they weren't ready to answer. What if closeness doesn't cost me myself? By the time they understand that safety was never the threat, it's often gone. So here's the truth that lands hardest in the end: you weren't trying to hold them back. You were giving them a place to stand. One of the most important differences between you and an avoidant isn't emotional capacity, it's timing. You felt the loss early. You felt the confusion, the grief, the self-doubt, the longing. When the connection fractured, it hit you immediately because you were emotionally present inside the relationship. You didn't run from the pain, you stood in it. And as painful as that was, it set you on a path the avoidant delayed for as long as possible. Avoidants don't process loss in real time. They postpone it. Psychologically, avoidance is a strategy of emotional deferral. When something hurts, they move away from it. They distract, they compartmentalize, they tell themselves they're fine, and for a while they genuinely believe it. Life goes on, routines stay intact, new interactions appear. On the surface, it looks like resilience. But underneath, nothing has been metabolized. The emotional experience hasn't been integrated. It's been shelved. This creates a dangerous illusion that they've moved on faster than you. But healing isn't about speed. It's about depth. You processed the ending while it was still raw. You questioned yourself. You reflected on patterns. You confronted uncomfortable truths. And through that process, something shifted. The pain didn't disappear overnight, but it transformed. It became insight. It became self-awareness. It became boundaries. While the avoidant was running from feeling, you were learning from it. And that's why the loneliness curve looks so different. For you, loneliness peaks early and gradually declines as growth takes place. For avoidance, loneliness is delayed, but it compounds. At first, they feel light, unburdened, free, but as time passes, something strange happens. The distractions lose their effectiveness. The novelty fades. The same emotional emptiness begins to reappear regardless of who they're with or what they're doing. This is when loneliness arrives, not as heartbreak, but as a quiet reckoning. It shows up in repetition. Same dynamics, different people, same emotional ceiling, same feeling of something missing that can't be named. And eventually there's a realization that's deeply unsettling. If the pattern keeps repeating, the common denominator might not be the relationships. It might be them. This is the moment avoidants fear most because it removes the external target. There's no one left to blame, no relationship to exit, no intensity to escape, just the self, unbuffered. Meanwhile, you're in a different place entirely because you didn't avoid the pain, you outgrew it. You've already asked the hard questions. You've already sat with the discomfort. You've already restructured your emotional world. And while the avoidant is just beginning to feel the weight of loneliness, you're regaining clarity, stability, and self-trust. This is why avoidants often resurface later, not when the relationship ends, but when the emotional bill comes due, when the silence gets too loud, when they realize that what they avoided wasn't the relationship, it was the inner work. Loneliness hits avoidance later because they postponed feeling, but when it arrives without relief, without distraction, and without an easy exit. And here's the truth that brings it all together. You healed by facing the pain early, they suffer later because they ran from it. There's a moment, often much later, often in silence, when the avoidant finally understands what they lost. Not the relationship in abstract terms, not the comfort of familiarity, but the person themselves. Because not all connections are equal, and not all people who love deeply do so without loathing themselves. What they never realized about you is that you were rare in a way that doesn't announce itself loudly, but leaves a lasting psychological imprint. Avoidants are used to certain roles. They often attract people who chase, people who overfunction emotionally, people who abandon themselves to keep connection alive. That dynamic feels familiar. It reinforces their belief that closeness is destabilizing and that they must remain emotionally separate to survive it. But you didn't fit that mold. You were emotionally available without being dependent, intimate without being invasive, present without being self-erasing. And that difference mattered more than they understood at the time. You weren't just offering connection, you were modeling something. Self-awareness, emotional regulation, the ability to sit with discomfort without collapsing or controlling. You knew your needs, but you didn't weaponize them. You wanted closeness, but you didn't beg for it. And when you felt imbalance, you noticed it. That level of internal clarity is unsettling to an avoidant because it quietly raises the standard. What made you rare wasn't how much you gave, it was how much you didn't abandon yourself in the process. Avoidants often assume that people who love them will stay no matter what. That connection is maintained through endurance rather than mutuality. But you broke that assumption. You didn't threaten. You didn't chase indefinitely. When the emotional cost became too high, you stepped back. And that was the moment the dynamic shifted in a way they couldn't reverse. They lost someone who was capable of deep intimacy and self-respect. That combination is uncommon. Many people can connect. Fewer can connect without losing boundaries. Even fewer can walk away when those boundaries are repeatedly crossed. And that's what makes the loss hit differently. Because they didn't lose you to another person, they lost you to your own growth. Only later do they understand the implications. They begin to encounter relationships that look similar on the surface but feel different underneath. The depth isn't there. The emotional intelligence is missing. The consistency feels performative rather than grounded. And slowly, a realization forms. Not everyone brings emotional safety and self-awareness into connection. Some people bring intensity. Others bring distraction. You brought clarity. Clarity is uncomfortable when you're avoiding yourself, but it's unforgettable once it's gone. They may not articulate it this way, but the regret isn't about missing you. It's about realizing how rare it is to meet someone who can love without losing their center. Someone who can be present without controlling. Someone who sees patterns, names them, and still offers compassion. By the time that realization arrives, you're no longer standing in the same place. You've recalibrated, you've raised your standards, you've integrated the lesson, and the person they lost is no longer available in the form they once knew. Here's the truth that lingers long after the connection ends. They didn't just lose a relationship, they lost access to someone who knew how to love consciously. What ultimately becomes impossible for the avoidant to escape isn't your absence, it's your evolution. This is the part of the story that rarely gets talked about because it doesn't involve confrontation, explanations, or dramatic endings. It happens quietly, internally, and it's far more destabilizing than any argument ever was. While the avoidant stayed emotionally static, you didn't. Your growth wasn't performative. You didn't change to prove a point. You changed because pain forced you to become more conscious. You reflected. You questioned your patterns. You learned where you overgave, where you waited too long, where you mistook potential for reality. And through that process, something fundamental shifted. You stopped organizing your life around emotional uncertainty. For an avoidant, this is deeply unsettling. Avoidants are comfortable when others remain predictable. When people keep hoping, chasing, explaining, or staying emotionally available without reciprocity. That dynamic allows them to remain unchanged. But your growth removed that structure. You no longer played the role that made avoidance possible. And without that role being filled, the avoidant is left with themselves. This is where the real consequence begins. They may not immediately feel regret. What they feel first is confusion, a subtle loss of control. Not control over you, but control over the narrative they relied on. You were supposed to stay the same, caring, available, emotionally accessible from a distance, but you didn't. You moved forward, and your movement creates a mirror they can't look away from. Your growth silently asks a question they can't answer. Why am I still here emotionally while they're not? This is the moment when comparison becomes unavoidable. They see you clearer, calmer, more grounded, not hardened, but whole. You no longer seek validation from them. You don't orbit their emotional availability. And that shift forces them to confront a painful truth. You didn't need them to evolve. You needed distance from the dynamic. Avoidants struggle most when they realize they were not the catalyst for your growth. Your self-respect was, and that realization triggers something profound. Because growth exposes stagnation. When someone you once distanced yourself from becomes emotionally fuller, it highlights the cost of avoidance. The patterns haven't changed. The same emotional ceilings exist. The same disconnect follows them from relationship to relationship. And suddenly, the problem no longer feels external. Your growth becomes the consequence they never anticipated. Not because you left, but because you didn't collapse. You didn't beg. You didn't regress. You integrated the experience and moved forward with clarity. And clarity is terrifying to someone who avoids self-examination. This is why avoidants often feel a delayed pull toward people they lost. Not out of love alone, but out of unresolved comparison. You represent a version of the path they didn't take. Emotional courage, accountability, depth, and they feel the distance between where they are and where you've gone. You don't need to say anything. Your life speaks for you. And here's the final truth that closes the loop. They didn't lose you because you left. They lost you because you grew, and growth can't be undone. When you step back and look at the entire arc of this story, the truth becomes unmistakable. This was never about you being too much, too emotional, or too demanding. It was about two very different ways of relating to pain, intimacy, and growth. You chose awareness. You chose to feel. You chose to face discomfort and turn it into understanding. And because of that choice, you move forward. They chose distance. Avoidant patterns don't collapse relationships in dramatic ways. They erode them quietly, through silence, through emotional postponement, through the belief that safety exists in separation. But what this journey reveals is that separation didn't protect them from loneliness. It delayed it. Avoidance didn't preserve their freedom. It limited their depth. And walking away from connection didn't bring peace. It exposed what they refused to heal. Your role in this story was never to save them. It was to reveal what was possible. You showed that intimacy doesn't require self-abandonment, that closeness can coexist with boundaries, that love can be conscious, grounded, and emotionally mature. And when you stepped away, you didn't collapse. You evolved. That evolution is the final lesson. While they remain caught in the same internal loops, you've integrated the experience and raised your standards. You no longer confuse potential with reality. You no longer negotiate your worth. You no longer wait in emotional uncertainty. And whether they ever articulate it or not, that's the realization that stays with them the longest. So if there's one thing to take with you, let it be this. You didn't lose someone who couldn't meet you. You outgrew a dynamic that required you to shrink. And growth, once chosen, is something no one can ever take away.